Being a chartered manager means that you are a specialist in that area, and it means you've got all the skills to do the job to the best of its ability.
You are seen as a leader, a true leader who has credentials behind the great work you've already been doing.
It's enhanced my understanding, it's enhanced my skill set, it's improved my mindset.
It makes all the difference.
This session is recorded and will be available on the CMI website and YouTube channel. Join the conversation by using the live chat box for your questions and comments. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's digital event, Successful Collaboration Feedback That Adds Value. My name is Amelia Phillips, and I'm an event delivery coordinator at CMI. Don't forget to join the conversation by using the live chat box, and feel free to ask any questions you have for our speakers, and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A session. I will now hand over to Harvey Aldershaw, the event lead for the North East Yorkshire and Humberside Regional Board, to begin today's event.
Thank you, Amelia, and hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for what should be a really interesting session about how successful collaboration can create feedback that adds value, exploring the importance of effective feedback, the sort of challenges that might be faced when we're both giving and receiving feedback, and how we can overcome them. So before we start the session and I hand over to our guest speaker, Sarah, I'll briefly introduce myself. So my name's Harvey. I'm the events lead for the CMI North East Yorkshire and Humberside board. In my full-time role, I'm a national management trainee on the Local Government Associations Impact Graduate Scheme at Barnsley Council, where I've been placed across a range of placements, such as within the Culture and Visitor Economy team, in the Arts and Events team, within Strategic Housing, within the Chief Executive's team, and now I'm currently based in Public Health, spread across growth and sustainability, embedding a healthy places approach. So to start off the session, I'll hand over to Sarah, who is going to briefly introduce herself and her role. And can you please also share why this discussion about feedback is so important to you?
Thank you, Harvey. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be talking to all of you today about a topic that is very close to my heart. So I am Sarah Salahuddin. I am a Deputy Chair and DEI lead for the North East Yorkshire and Humberside CMI Regional Board. And in my day job, I'm a change leader. Why feedback is important and why I'm so passionate about this topic is because I think that feedback shapes people's confidence and opportunities, especially for those who may be less heard in a room. So it is very important from an inclusiveness perspective, and generally it helps for people to get better, and it helps better to get best. So for me, feedback is absolutely a gift. It reduces guesswork, it builds trust, and it helps people to do their best without burning out. So it allows people to hone in, improve their skills. And something that I find really useful from a feedback perspective is the concept of radical candor. That Kim Scott has introduced and written a book about, which is all about caring personally but challenging directly. So radical candor is about avoiding the trap of either being too soft or too harsh, and instead being both clear and kind at the same time. And it runs across two axes of caring personally, challenging directly. And the four boxes are ruinous empathy, where you can be kind but unclear; obnoxious aggression, where you can be clear but unkind; manipulative insincerity, where you're neither, so there's low personal care and low challenge; and then radical candor, which is you're caring personally and challenging directly, so both are high. And that enables colleagues, your team members, your people you work with, and yourself to thrive and work collaboratively in the workplace.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really insightful. So in today's fast-moving and cross-functional environments, maintaining effective communication and ensuring feedback is consistently integrated into collaborative efforts, it can be quite challenging. With teams often working across departments and at pace, it's important to strike a balance between keeping everyone informed and avoiding unnecessary meetings that can lead to fatigue. With this in mind, how do you embed feedback loops without adding without adding meeting feedback?
And I think that's a really interesting question, Howie, because you're right that, we're all, with the changing and evolving ways of working, we're all adapting our work styles. We all seem to be in more meetings, at least I know personally for myself, that you can get meeting fatigue. And sometimes, it can be the conversations which matter the most can suffer as well, such as embedding the feedback and how do you find time for giving the feedback. So there's some practical tips that I'll share, which I have found really useful, which is, not to schedule it separately. In the moment feedback is a great gift. And, the more you do it, the more comfortable you become at giving and receiving it. So it should be part of your daily work, not necessarily a separate meeting that you should be looking for. Yes, there will be occasions where you do need the separate meeting. So I'm not saying it all comes down to on how you work best with your teams, with your groups and in the workplace. But feedback should be part of the daily work. It might be a small 2 minutes at the end of a conversation. Okay, what do we want to keep? What's the stop, start, and continue that we want to do? So it's using micro feedback loops, which can really be vital and give you insightful information on how your teams are performing, and also what works well for them and what doesn't, and you're facilitating that. Using different channels, we have so many ways to communicate now. Teams, instant messaging, picking up the phone, you're talking to somebody. Yeah, a meeting finishes at 2 minutes after the meeting. How did that go? Did it hit the mark? Someone's presenting at a committee or a board meeting. You can give them cues to help, and then you can make some observations. I think it's really important that when you're providing feedback, you use simple structures and you use specific examples, because then that really helps in focusing on what the feedback is, what the impact was. So what was the situation, what was the behavior, and what was the impact? So it creates that environment where people feel safe, and they will then be willing to listen and adjust their behaviors if the impact was adverse. And one thing I would say about feedback is positive and constructive. We often think that it has to be, when something goes wrong or something's not quite right. But take the time to celebrate and give positive feedback when someone's done something really well. They've presented, very confidently. They've captured everything. And sometimes it's that context that will really help and push the team member or the colleague to perform and even excel further. That point about moving from better to best can then be emphasized in a better way. And, sometimes there are sensitive conversations, which might mean that you have to create the time and space so you are not distracted. I am guilty, and I say that to my team sometimes, that multitasking is a virtue and a curse at the same time. So for some of your sensitive conversations, make sure that you are there and there is active listening, that you allow the person to respond as well. So the feedback to avoid meeting fatigue, it's all about how you can incorporate it without creating an additional weekly feedback meeting, and how you share the feedback, how you provide in the moment feedback, how you provide positive and constructive challenge, and give examples with it. So now that I've shared what I think works in terms of and what I do, Harvey, would you like to share some of the things that you think have worked, or what you think might work better, might not work?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for sharing those insights. It's really interesting to hear. So as someone that's recently come into full-time employment for a few years ago, and having moved across different teams, I've seen quite a different approach to how frequently feedback's given and in what format. And obviously it is really useful having catch-ups and one-to-ones and those formal set spaces for feedback. But I also find those informal chats, just meeting someone in a breakout room and having a brief chat about something, having a chat over lunch, going for a walk, those sort of spaces are really useful for feedback. And as you say, positive as well as negative feedback. That positive feedback and reinforcement is really useful for morale, for sort of bringing the team together and having those one-to-one conversations, but also having conversations with the team as a whole and sharing that feedback about things that are going well, things that might be improved, and that really encourages those conversations, those active conversations. And it's really great to see in that poll that we put up as well that a lot of people are saying that they're giving feedback frequently, weekly or monthly, and not just infrequently or just at those formal spaces.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And like you say, that the frequency and the location or the logistics of when it happens, it can make such a difference as well. And as we go into more and more hybrid working, I think that that's something that to be aware of when you can leverage certain situations, while certain feedback might lend itself better to be communicated virtually. People might have their own preferences. They might want to be in a certain environment, and others you might feel that it has to be in an in-person situation. And like you say, the poll is quite interesting, and it's good to see that people are, a large majority is still doing it weekly. All I would say is that the more frequently you do it, the more it gets part of your collaborating working style. And that's what helps you to succeed as a high-performing team.
Definitely. I think that's a good point that I would definitely echo. And related to that conversation about feedback, obviously positive feedback is really important and giving feedback, but then it also, especially if it's more negative or more critical feedback, it can stir quite an emotional and physical response, especially when it's unexpected or, as I say, critical in nature. And these reactions can influence how we process and act on the feedback. So recognizing and managing these responses is key to fostering constructive dialogue and personal growth. So I wanted to ask you, what's happening in our bodies and brains when we hear feedback, especially when it's unexpected or critical, and how can we regulate those responses in the moment?
Yeah, so as you say, absolutely. Unexpected feedback can trigger a threat response. It's almost like, you can feel anxious, you can feel defensive, and people can be like, they can freeze as well. And sometimes it's good to just pause and name the feeling that you're experiencing. And naming it sometimes just helps in kind of recognizing and then what the trigger was and how you might want to deal with it. And I can't stress enough that, sometimes as a manager who gives feedback, that don't be afraid to share that feeling or that the response that you experience, because that will help understand the person who's providing the feedback, and it will enable them that was not the intention. The intention, I think one thing is important to recognize, that feedback is well intended. It is to help improve or to help you continue in excelling what you're doing. So it is important that you give yourself the time to kind of pause, reflect, and then deep breaths. I know these are basic things, but name the reaction. Am I feeling scared? Am I feeling nervous? Am I feeling angry? And they all emotions are valid, but the moment you start naming your emotion, it helps you in finding out what the trigger or the cause was, and then how you can move forward in addressing it. And if it means that you want to pause the conversation for the person to return to the conversation at a later date, that's absolutely fine as well. When I was doing my PhD, I remember initially I would be so defensive about when my supervisor would provide me feedback. And then I had a really good conversation with my husband who had already done his PhD. And he said, you need to stop feeling like as if he's ripping your work to pieces which is how it felt with a red pen. But it was more that he was helping me on how to write academically. And I felt as if my writing style was being criticized, or, I didn't know how to write. But it was more that I was being trained to write academic research papers. So it's when you can understand the intent and the benefit of it, then it'll help. But you have to first be able to deal with your emotions, which is not always easy, but naming the emotion definitely helps. At least in my case, even to this day, if I get any feedback, my first reaction is, am I being defensive? Or, is there something that I need to? So the curious element is really important. And it's actually heartening to see how many people find it that, they're curious. And that's where we need to train ourselves. I don't know. I mean, I still get nervous as well. So you'll experience varying emotions at different times. What's your experience been?
I would definitely echo what you were saying around sort of just the word feedback or appraisal, or it does trigger some sort of emotion in you, whether it was actually needed or whether it even is positive feedback or whether it's more critical. But I think being open to feedback is really important. And across my different teams, I've experienced quite a lot of different management styles and how people approach feedback. And I would say that in teams where I have had a manager that does give more feedback, whether that's positive or negative, it's definitely helped me grow a lot more and develop my skills. Just having that person that's continually reminding me of how I can improve, how I can better my work in one way or another. It's really important for my personal growth and development. And the next time I go into that, I feel more confident. And you do see the effects the next time you go into doing the same thing. You get less feedback, or at least less critical feedback, and less things to change and alter, more things that you can take away. And then the more you do things well, the better you get at doing them. It's like that saying, perfect practice makes perfect.
Yes.
And I think that is really, really important.
I think that's a really important point, that, practice makes perfect. So it's almost like, the more you go through it, the more you'll understand yourself. And the key about dealing with your emotions, everybody will deal with it differently, and everybody will have different circumstances. I think I just glanced through one of the comments or questions that, what about neurodiverse colleagues? And it's just something, because it's quite close to my heart from a DEI perspective as well. I think it's about understanding what the needs are of your colleagues and those around you, and how can they best be supported. But equally, for those colleagues to be encouraged to share what works for them. For some people, written, structured feedback is better than having a conversation, because that might trigger some of the reactions. So when we were talking about, the situation and the environment to provide feedback, I think the environment plays a really important part. That whether, I think if you are summoned to a meeting room, some people might find it more nerve-wracking than a water cooler chat or stay back in a meeting which you're already having. So the environment really is important. And then one point that, when we started, I didn't mention, was around essentially creating that psychologically safe space. So we've all heard about, creating psychological safety. There's been a lot of research on it. What is important to remember is that psychological safety does not mean that you don't provide feedback. Psychological safety means that you create a safe environment so that feedback can be received and shared and worked upon in a collaborative and constructive manner. So it's recognizing, going back to the question on your brain's and body's response, it is recognizing your emotions, it's naming those emotions, and then having the conversations if you feel that any adjustments in terms of how feedback communication is done would help in managing those emotions and reactions.
Definitely. And I think that draws back to what we were saying previously about that open feedback loops and more informal conversations. You get to know your workforce better, and you get to understand the different situations, the different contexts in which they would like to receive feedback that would make them feel more comfortable, whether it's positive or critical. I think that's really interesting. And it's, as you say, it's really interesting to see that now more people are saying that they're more curious when receiving feedback, and that's really positive. But then also, obviously, there is that element of defensiveness, and that's natural when delivering or receiving feedback. And defensiveness can be a barrier to growth, learning, and constructive dialogue, especially for leaders striving to model openness and resilience. But recognizing these moments in ourselves and in others without causing embarrassment or shame, it is essential for cultivating a positive and productive culture. So with this in mind, how can leaders recognize defensiveness in themselves or others without shaming and steer back to learning?
So defensiveness, like you said, defensiveness often shows up when one of the two things is missing. Either the challenge feels too strong or the care isn't clear. So, you can feel like maybe there's more criticism than support or than the specific example, but other times it can also be that you're already going with a preconceived view. So the interpretation of the feedback then lends itself in leading to be the defensive attitude. I think one of the most important things is that you have to normalize discomfort. You have to get comfortable in being uncomfortable. So it's okay. Like, the first time you hear it, it is difficult, and you might not fully agree with it. It is important that when it is being shared, that the intent is made clear. So it's really, really important. And that is both ways, whether a leader is giving it to their teams or the team is providing feedback to the leader, because feedback is a loop and feedback should always go both ways. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. But just reaffirm the intent of the feedback. And then going back to specific examples, I think it's making sure that it's, I observed at that point this behavior and this was the impact. So the moment you put specifics, I think it's helpful for the individual receiving the feedback as well to understand where the challenge is coming from and where the care might be needed as well. And always offer choices, like, it's not a closed end that this has to be done this way. It has to be to the individual on how they respond to that feedback, and to come up with ways in which you can address the feedback, and giving the opportunity to, it's not necessarily rationalizing, because the first thing that happens if you're defensive is that you're going to explain it. But rather than explaining it, it's understanding the reasons behind it or what the options and the solutions might be. One of the things that I've learned from a defensiveness perspective is that I do not respond to emails immediately. If I find some email a bit like critical or, and I feel defensive. So just in terms of how I address defensiveness, I might even type it, but I will never send it, because your emotions get the better of you. So it's almost, and that's where when I was talking about naming the emotion piece comes. I know I'm being defensive. If someone says that this hasn't been done, I'll start, but this is because you didn't send this or this didn't, and just step back from that and take the time to process it. Think about the specific examples. Think about the examples. There is always merit in almost thinking when you're looking at options. So would that have been better when I did that? So if you have other examples of another situation, then you can quote, then you can discuss with your manager. So it's about being okay with being comfortable, but then understanding on how you go, what are the next steps, and how do you help somebody to go through those and navigate those next steps. What about you? How do you manage it?
Like you say, yeah, it's definitely something to be aware of in yourself and in others if they're defensive about receiving feedback. And I think it's how you view feedback. Someone in the chat a few minutes ago mentioned about the fact that I keep saying critical feedback and instead calling it developmental feedback, which is a much better word to use, because it is that, and that sort of reflects how I personally view feedback and how it can come across in some ways. And that's both on how you take it personally, but then also how it's communicated. And like you were saying, receiving feedback in a Teams message or via email, it's really hard to gauge the tone of how someone's saying something, and whether it is meant to be positive, whether it's meant to be a criticism, whether it's meant to encourage you to try something different, try better. Whereas having those in-person conversations, obviously it's not always the most it's not always viable to be able to give in-person feedback. It can be really important for communicating something that you want to communicate and it coming across in the right way. And it's interesting to see in the chat quite a spread of different responses about what people worry about when they give feedback. Most people saying about upsetting someone, and then similarly damaging the relationship, being seen as critical. I think it does show the impacts that even just the word feedback can have on people and how defensive people can be when receiving it. But it's about sort of reframing the positive effects of feedback, however it's meant or conveyed.
I think that's a really good point, and the way you said it, that it's the connotations of the word that have, in the workplace over the years, over centuries probably, that have taken, that our first reaction can be one of a defensive feeling. And what is even more interesting is when we look at the poll currently, it talks about what worries people most is about upsetting someone, damaging the relationship. And there's a really small percentage about being comfortable giving feedback. And it's interesting because if we think about our previous poll where people are curious about the feedback themselves, but we find it difficult to convince ourselves that the other person would be curious, and we're more worried about upsetting them. And that is where when working in teams, when working with individuals, it is important that if we have a really psychologically safe place, that will encourage people that it is not about damaging a personal relationship or upsetting. It is striving to that goal of improving, excelling, and where all feedback is welcome, whether that is someone's excelling and whether there is some developmental, as you said, or someone in the comments said, or constructive feedback, so to enable you to improve that. But it is, and that's where it becomes so intertwined with our feelings, with our thoughts, and how we might be perceived or how the other person might perceive us. So it's a continuous, it's a piece that we work on, it's a personal growth piece. It's a personal development objective almost to enable. I also think that it's important that even if someone is good at giving feedback, it's equally important that they're good at receiving feedback as well. So it's how do you train yourself to do the full feedback loop?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it is important to remember that feedback does go both ways, and that someone might be worried about receiving feedback, but also someone might be worried about giving feedback and how that comes across. And that goes both a leader giving feedback to a direct report and then vice versa, because it is important. And I think it is important to talk about that power dynamic in any feedback exchange, and it really can't be underestimated. So factors such as one's role within the team, the level of seniority, the person's background, they all contribute to how feedback is perceived received. And these can create barriers and even distort the message, the intended message, potentially affecting the recipient's confidence and willingness to engage openly. So, Sarah, how would you say that power dynamics shape how feedback is heard, and what can managers do to level the playing field?
That's a really interesting question, and a very pertinent one as well, Harvey. Simply because I see it playing out. You always have leaders above you who might provide you feedback, and then you are a leader, and then you have to provide feedback to your teams. So I very much experience that in my role. And sometimes more seniority can mean larger blind spots. So, due to less honest feedback, that can also happen. Sometimes, the feedback doesn't come upwards. I think it's about being honest, encouraging and seeking the feedback. I think that is important for a leader. We've talked a lot in terms of giving feedback to teams and, on what are some of the things that we can do. But it is important that we encourage teams to provide feedback to managers, to senior leaders. And sometimes it's almost skip level meetings can help in that. So, if it's not always the line manager, you having a meeting with line manager's manager or a conversation to share some of the feedback or to share your views can be really helpful, because at different leadership levels, you'll make different observations and the comms might be landing differently. So it's important for each employee and colleague to be able to contribute to the effective running of a team, department, organization. So one of the tools that I find quite useful is a Johari window. It's a simple model of self-awareness, which basically shows what we know about ourselves, what others know about us, and where our blind spots are, highlighting that feedback helps reduce those blind spots. So I've done this with a large, teams of teams in my area. And it was really interesting what others know about you, what you know about yourself, but there are blind spots, and that's what will enable to kind of work upon and understand. And I know that the CMI has several articles as well on feedback, so I would encourage people to read about it. But it's quite a useful tool, because if you're looking at a broader range of people to feedback to you, then it can help. Also, I think managers should be encouraged to invite feedback. The feedback shouldn't just be one way. It's active encouragement. So the senior leaders should encourage it, but also looking at, across an organization, people you engage with. You might work very closely on a project. I think you referred to that it can be a cross-section of an organization that you might be working on. Just take that initiative to seek feedback and provide it. If you see something that's a really handy tip that you've seen the team do or another department do, then share that. Talk about best practice, I think, and sharing what has worked. Create safe channels and have those feedback loops available. So you will never find a leader who'll say, I don't want to listen, or I don't want the feedback. But it's sometimes they might not always say that I want to listen, but you have to almost go with that, and that's the key thing. That if you have observed something and you have feedback to offer, feedback is absolutely a gift. I think that's the ultimate, line that we have to remember. So don't be afraid to provide it and share it. And if you can structure it with examples, with specific things and what you'd like to do, what the options are, then it would be very welcome. I've given it to you from my view in terms of both as a leader and, of course, managing teams. And then I don't hesitate. I do sometimes. Of course, you have to think about how you tailor the communication, but feedback to some of my senior leaders. What has your experience been, Harvey?
I would definitely echo what you were saying around not being afraid to challenge and question things. When I first joined the organization I'm at currently, we had meetings with the senior leaders, the executive directors of the organization, and they told us, if you see anything while you're working that doesn't look right, you think we could do it more effectively, you're sort of unsure why we're doing things how the way we're doing things, if it's just something that we've done for 20, 30, 40, however many years, then please tell us, please talk to us. And I think having that environment where senior leaders are so open to feedback is really important. And generally I felt that senior leaders and feeding up people want that, because then that then falls down back onto the whole organization, and it can positively shape going forward how the organization does things, run things, can streamline systems. And seeing the poll that it is very hard to give line managers, senior leaders that feedback, as well as peers, people that they're talking to, because you don't want to hurt feelings. You're worried that it might not be received in the right way. But I think, as you said, giving that structured feedback and that evidence feedback, it does have an impact, and it is really important, and generally is received and invited.
That's true. And I'm actually surprised at the high percentage even for the peers one, because that's a really important group that you can leverage. And there are different ways to do that. So there can be peer coaching, if you have a difficult situation, if you can really leverage your peers, and if you develop that strong relationship and that strong collaborative ways of working, that you can be open and honest in providing the feedback, then you can also leverage their experience in then providing feedback upwards, downwards, and managing your teams. So I would definitely encourage people that, using your peers is a very safe space. Yes, it can feel difficult, but don't limit yourself necessarily to a specific team or a department. But people at the same level with the same experience may be able to share and help you in how you shape some of that. But yeah, the poll is very revealing that people find it hardest to give line managers the feedback. So I'm going to become very aware that I encourage my direct reports to give me honest feedback.
Definitely, yeah, it's definitely something to consider. And finally, before we move on to some pre-submitted questions and some questions in the Q&A, I'd like to ask you, what is the best piece of feedback that you've ever received? And also, what's the most useful piece of feedback that you could give right now?
So the best feedback I've received which is very clear and specific. I can't give any one example, but probably I would have to say my PhD supervisor, as much as it was the most difficult as well, because it was very clear in terms of how to write the thesis and what not to do, what were the catch-outs. I think clarity just helps, and what good looks like really helps. That's important in terms of, which is why I really stress on passing on the feedback when someone's done something that they've done it well, because they'll know next time that if they've written a paper well, they've presented at a committee well, then they've done the job right. What is the one piece of feedback I can give is just be honest. Honesty really helps, and being aware of your own emotions and reactions to what you are being provided, the information you're being provided with, definitely helps. I don't know if that's feedback or not, but it's difficult to give feedback. I think it's more my takeaway, Harvey, for the session. And I do believe that radical candor, is is a great way to guide you if you're struggling in terms of how do you care enough and challenge correctly. And it's finding that balance of care and challenge. So, you want people to thrive and you want people to succeed. And it's making sure that everybody feels included and can move forward.
Definitely, yeah. Just to share a piece of feedback that I've personally received, and it also relates to what someone said in the chat about standing out. I think it's really important to not just be known for the person that does a lot of hard work. Obviously, it's important to be a hard worker, but not just a steady pair of hands. I think it's really important through feedback or through finding your niche, finding something that makes you stand out. I think that's really important for working your way up the ladder and sort of making a name for yourself within the organization, within other organizations as well. I think that's a really useful piece of feedback that I've received. And then just reflecting back on what we previously talked about not being afraid to challenge things and question things and feed that back up to managers, senior leaders. That's really important.
Yeah, and that's really good. And I can say that because we are in a conversation and we've worked together towards this event as well, that you're not afraid to challenge, Harry. So that's a positive bit of feedback. I really like the way that you come across and you structure yourself and your, questioning process. So it is important that we listen to the feedback and we continue building it as we go along.
Definitely, yes. So now, thank you for that. Thank you for your insights. So now we're going to move on to some questions. And firstly, we'll start with some pre-submitted questions that we got before the session. So the first one I'll talk to is a question from Laura, who says, how do you provide feedback to someone who can't control their emotions and behaviours?
So it's an interesting question, Laura, and it goes into the point about helping them name the emotions. Getting on the behavior piece, I would say it's the situation, behavior, and impact. It's getting specific, but what is really important is to first control the emotion, understand the reasons why if you can help them name the emotion, then you can understand the underlying cause of the emotion, and then creating the environment where you can deal with the feedback and share the feedback. I think it has to be a staged process, is what I would say. Of course, every individual is different, and as managers, leaders, we want the best for the colleagues as well. But it is helping them name that emotion, understanding the cause of it, creating an environment where they feel safe and secure to share what is bringing about those reactions, and then getting specific and sharing the specifics of the situation, the behavior, and the impact it is having, and working from there on with what the options might be, what are the choices, what is it that they would like, and what is the support that they would like from yourself, and what support you can offer, what support might be available to them from within the organization, from outside the organization. I think it's difficult to give an absolute wrapped up solution, but I would strongly urge that it's a staged process where you try and understand and help them understand and name their emotion and take it from there. I hope that helps. I don't know, Harvey, whether you have any other views on it.
Great. Yeah, I'd say, as you say, like that staged approach, being sensitive to the situation and trying to respond in the most effective way. And then I guess this relates to another question that we've had pre-submitted as well, which from Irene, who is a bit of a sort of case study, but saying that they've got a team member who rejects all feedback, whether it's positive or developmental, and that managers have also faced a similar situation with this employee. So wondering how they can sort of combat that situation, how they can affect.
Yeah, and this is a tough situation, Irene. And actually the fact that you're the second manager facing it is really important data point, because it suggests it's just not about one conversation going wrong. There's something deeper going on with that individual. So similar to Laura's question, where the emotions were, we were unclear of what was happening. Again, I'd approach it by stepping back from giving feedback to first rebuilding the conditions where feedback can land. I think that's really key here. You want to be able to create an environment where the feedback will land. It sounds like right now it's a denial or a rejection phase. And using radical candor when someone rejects all feedback can also help. It's often because they're not experiencing enough psychological safety. So the focus shifts to strengthening the care personally. So it's almost, you're more focused rather than the challenge directly. You're more focused on the caring personally side. But practically, I'd say similar to the previous one, I'd say it'll be a staged piece, but you'd start with a reset conversation that it isn't about performance, but about understanding and asking things like, how is feedback working at the moment? What's been frustrating? What's working? What's not working? And trying to get to the underlying reason of why there might be that rejection or the resentment, if there is. And then I'd move to very specific factual feedback focused on the observable behavior, similar to the situation, behavior, and impact piece. But that clarity is really important. But I think it's a journey that you have to go along with the colleague.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. And then moving on to our last pre-submitted question from Henry, who asks, when shifting from siloed authorities to a centralized complaint system, how can leaders give value-adding feedback that drives standardization while keeping mission-critical triage across units?
This is interesting because it's a classic tension in transformation. So you're almost going standardization versus responsiveness. And I guess the important thing here is that feedback needs to connect those two, not choose between them. I think that's where the beauty of feedback is, that it can link, it can be a loop, it can be a continuous thing. So when you move to a centralized model, the goal isn't just consistency for the sake of it. It's about improving outcomes. So it's for leaders, the key is giving feedback that does two things at the same time. So anchor teams in what good looks like centrally, clear criteria, shared definitions, consistent ways. That's what drives standardization. But second, protect space for judgment at the front line, particularly in triage, because that's where your mission critical prioritization happens. So personally and practically, I think what has worked for me is that the most effective feedback focuses on 3 levels. You can have outcome focused, process focused, and insight focused. And it's really important because feedback shouldn't just reinforce the system, it should improve it. I think that's the whole point of it. So it's about the balance comes from being clear on standards, but using feedback as a two-way loop. So you're reinforcing consistency while continuously refining how triage works in practice. And I know it's easier to say these things, but it's the more you do and the more you get that clarity on being outcome focused, process focused, insight focused, and maintaining that healthy tension and linking it using the feedback rather than separating it out. That's where it helps the most.
Thank you. So now we're going to move on to some questions from the chat. So firstly, I wanted to pick up on this question, which is quite interesting, sort of from the other perspective of someone receiving feedback. And they ask, what's the best way to respond to feedback you don't fully agree with?
That's interesting. So I think it's, and the best way, the first thing not to do is be defensive about it. And even if you don't agree, I think the first thing is to understand your reaction and how you feel, how it makes you feel. And once, if it makes you angry, or if it makes you, I don't know, confused, I'm just using examples, then try and understand what is the reason. And once you have worked out how and why the reasons are about the feedback that has been shared, then having a conversation to understand if there are examples, specific examples of why the feedback is being provided, and then being able to explain why you don't agree. So it's looking at the specifics. And when you're looking at whether it's a specific deliverable, a document, or a meeting that's being quoted, what was the behavior? What was the impact of it? And then not challenging in a constructive way, because this is your opportunity to feed back on the feedback. I know it, and this is where the feedback loop really comes into play. You have the opportunity to use that to understand. You've articulated what you've understood the problem to be, and you help the other person to share back that you don't see that as an issue, or you don't fully agree with, and then you'll be able to surface the points of disagreement. I think the important point is that you're able to surface what is it, where is the disagreement coming from, and what are the options. Remember when I talked about feedback, that it's really important that we have options moving forward. So it's sharing those options, working out the options for yourself, and sharing it with the person who's provided you them, to say, these are the options I think, and then the conversation will flow, because you're not saying, I do not fully agree, I don't agree at all. You've actually made that effort to understand the feedback, why you don't agree, how do you see the situation or a particular behavior or a particular deliverable, and what you think are the options. And that's a way to move forward. I don't know if you have any tips, Avi, on this.
Yeah, I'd say it is really important to see that in yourself and sort of understand why you might not agree with certain feedback. I think it's easy to sort of feel defensive, even just the mention of receiving feedback. But then if you don't agree with it, it might make you feel angry or confused, and then it might break down that relationship with the person giving you feedback, and you might not listen to their feedback, and it might be not as effective. But I think it's, as you say, taking a step back and trying to understand why you don't agree with that feedback, whether it is a genuine thought that maybe this isn't how I want to do it. This is how I think this is better. But then having that conversation with that person that gave you feedback, sort of following it up. And I'm sure in most situations they would also be happy to receive that feedback on their feedback. And that opens a bit more dialogue and a bit of an open conversation, and that might in fact strengthen the relationship between the two of you. And the feedback might, therefore, you might want to receive feedback in a different way in the future, and that might also positively impact how that person gives feedback, and vice versa. So it can be a positive experience.
Absolutely. And I think the only other thing I would say, add to it, is give yourself time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sometimes it's important to give yourself the right amount of time, space, to be able to think and then develop a response. It's not essential that we need to respond to feedback immediately. It's okay to let your manager know, or let your peer know, or whoever's giving you or your team member know that you would like some time to reflect on it. And I think that's an important thing, that you are making time for yourself and taking the time to think about what someone else has shared with you. I know that's not always possible, but where possible, and if you feel the need, then make sure you do that. But a good question.
And then moving on to probably our last one for the session, where Rob said that he suffers with a fear of confrontation and struggles to give feedback, especially when it's negative. So how is it best to deal with this situation?
So it is several people find conflict or any type of confrontation difficult. I have managed somebody who is just so nice that he really struggles to give feedback or constructive feedback. And I always say there's a difference in being nice and being kind. And that when you think you suffer with that fear of confrontation, it's actually reminding yourself of what that feedback, the impact that feedback will eventually have, and what is your intent in giving that feedback. I think it's really important. Clearly, Rob, you care deeply, which is why you on the radical candor perspective, you care personally quite a bit. And that is why you struggle that you the confrontation or giving any negative constructive feedback, the impact it might have. What I would say is that thinking about it, and this is where the radical candor matrix would really help, is that there's a quadrant of ruinous empathy where you really care but you're unable to challenge. But what it might do that somebody else or the impact of not receiving that feedback might continue to have adverse impacts, and the opportunity and the benefit of your kind feedback that they could have had would have really helped them develop, improve. So it's understanding that, are there ways that you can do it? And maybe even when you're providing the feedback, setting it out that while, you feel uncomfortable yourself doing it, but your main intent is for providing the constructive feedback, how it would help, how it would improve. A simple technique that some managers I know use a lot is always balance it out. There's always something good to call about and something positive. I'm not saying that always should be the case, but if that helps in easing in for you to have the conversation, you can think about different ways you might do it. So if you don't like it, a face-to-face confrontation or a call conversation, you might want to do it in a written email, so keep it very factual, or you might forewarn the person to say, I'm going to be sending some feedback. It is very, keeping it specific, preparing the other person and preparing. I think in this case, it's more about preparing yourself, that, how will you respond if they come back because you don't like confrontation? Is it likely to lead to a confrontation, or is it an assumption? Our poll showed most people are curious. So it's careful wording of it. See how you can word that. And at this point, I'm going to let Harvey come in because I'm sure he has some tips as well. Harvey.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important to remember the positive impacts of feedback. And linking to what you were saying about radical candor and Kim Scott, I listened to one of her TED Talks where she gave an example of a person that worked for her that was really nice. Everyone liked them, but their work just wasn't up to scratch. But there was a concern, there was a fear of this providing this negative feedback to this person. But in the end, when it came to it, that feedback actually it would have been much more important and much more impactful if it came sooner, because then that can bring a positive impact and have that effect at a sooner point, and it can go on too long. Yeah. So thank you, Sarah, for all your insights, and thank you to everyone for joining us and for all the questions. As we're approaching the end of the session, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone, and I think it's really important to take away those learnings about feedback and embed them into our day-to-day and going into work. Sarah, is there anything you'd like to share?
I was just going to say, Harvey, that feedback is a gift, and you and I are very open to feedback. So if any of the attendees today would like to share any feedback, then please, I'm sure CMI would only be too keen for us to use that. So please do provide any feedback on the event, on the content, or anything else that you'd like to see in the future as well.
Thank you. And I'll pass to Amelia to wrap up the session.
And that is it for today's session. Thank you to our host, Harvey, and to our speaker, Zara, as well, for your experts and insights into this really, really important matter. Please stay tuned to hear more about CMI membership, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Don't forget, as a CMI member, you can find the latest management and leadership insights at managers.org.uk. If you're not yet a member, join our community to discover CMI Confidence with on-demand resources, our network of mentors, and industry-leading accreditations.